Have you heard of the new EU clinical trial regulation? In this video, we will cover the three main topics that will impact our ways of working in Ferring. First, submission of trials to health authorities and ethics committees. Second, transparency of the trials. And third, serious breaches to the regulation and protocol. But before we jump into that, let's visit the purpose of the regulation and when it will be effective for us. The aim of the regulation is to foster innovation and research in EU by facilitating the conduct of clinical trials that are running simultaneously in multiple EU countries. It allows the health authorities to drive collective decision-making on those trials, demanding us to increase the transparency of trial information to the public while strengthening the standards of safety for all participants in clinical trials in the EU. To enable all of this, the Clinical Trial Information System was launched. It's a single-point electronic communication platform to be used for all the key activities throughout the life cycle of a trial by the authorities, ethical committees and sponsors. The regulation is effective by the 31st of January 2023, and all clinical trials submitted in EU hereafter must adhere to the regulation. Clinical trials that were submitted before this date that are still running after the 31st of January 2025 must be transferred to comply with the regulation. What's important to know about the new regulation is that it applies to all clinical trials conducted in the European Economic Area, and it's applicable directly as it stands. What is stated in the regulation replaces national law. Now, let's jump to the first topic. Initial submission. In Ferring, we have decided that submissions for clinical trials conducted in the EU will be handled internally by Ferring staff from Global Regulatory Affairs in close collaboration with relevant functions. This allows us to take full control of the submission strategy agreed upon in the clinical trial team, as well as aligning the communication with both health authorities and ethics committees. A submission package consists of two parts, where Part 1 is similar to what was previously submitted to health authorities, and Part 2 is similar to what was previously submitted to ethics committees. Part 1 contains the main trial documents, such as the clinical trial protocol, investigator's brochure, and the study drug quality documentation. Part 2 contains the country and site-specific documentation, such as informed consent form in local language, principal investigator's CV, site suitability form, and insurance certificates. It must also include detailed information on the handling of biological samples from collection to destruction. That means that the clinical project team will, at an early stage, discuss and agree upon the strategy for biological samples in order to keep the submission timelines. The full assessment cycle for the health authorities, from submission to approval or rejection, takes between 2 to 3 months, depending on if any queries are sent out or not. Therefore, submitting all countries for Part 1 and all sites for Part 2 is the optimal submission strategy. This will allow the health authorities and ethics committees to align their opinions, and it will, in return, allow us to begin the trial in all countries and sites simultaneously, which is great. It also requires us to handle all local adaptations, redactions, and translations at the same time. To run this submission strategy, it's important for us to make decisions, up front, on which countries and sites to run the trial in. It's important because the assessment cycle from the authorities starts all over again, upon adding additional countries or sites. That means that the overall approval timelines for the clinical trial will be prolonged upon making decisions on countries and sites along the way. Optimally, the decision on which countries and sites to include is already made when preparing the protocol outline. So, in order for Ferring to benefit from the authorities' alignment across countries and responses, it is strongly recommended to include all countries and sites in the initial submission of the clinical trial. After the approval of a clinical trial, many milestones and changes are to be reported in CETUS, and we have to act quick. the given timelines for updating CETIS with the requested information is normally 15 calendar days. Now, let's move on to Ferring being more transparent to the public. With the EU regulation, a number of new requirements for increased transparency will take effect. Here are the biggest changes. Almost all clinical trial information will be made public via the CETIS database. This includes core documents like the investigator brochures, informed consent forms, trial protocols, inspection reports, and clinical trial reports. We're also required to publish a summary of trial results in a language easily understood by the average person on the street, a document called the Layperson Results Summary. Communicating the results of our trials in an easy language is an ethical obligation, and it contributes to greater trust from the society, from our trial participants, and their loved ones. When disclosing information, it is important that we do not reveal the identity of our trial participants. To prevent this, we redact the personal protected data, PPD, that otherwise would identify a person. We also make sure to redact any commercially confidential information, CCI, which is information that would undermine Ferring's economic interests if it was made public. The increased transparency should not prevent us from running clinical trials in EU. The public release of information can be postponed for up to 7 years, depending on the type of clinical trial. For more information about disclosure activities for your trial, please explore the SOP QD 00052663. And finally, let's talk about serious breaches. To ensure that all sponsors are conducting clinical trials according to the agreement with the authorities, to ensure continuous patient safety, and to ensure that the trial results can be trusted, the regulation is requiring Ferring, as trial sponsor, to report serious breaches to the regulation or clinical trial protocol. In practice, it means that Ferring has developed a process for employees, contractors, and vendors to be able to make the clinical trial sponsor, in our case Ferring, aware of potential serious breaches. All relevant parties such as, but not limited to, warehouse staff, lab staff, eCRF vendors, and investigators must follow the Ferring process for reporting potential serious breaches. A speedy reporting to Ferring is important because the regulation states that the sponsor shall report serious breaches in CETIS within 7 days from becoming aware of them. In essence, we have to ensure that serious breach reporting steps are covered in contracts and agreements for any trial relevant outsourced processes. The specific details of serious breach reporting and timelines will be outlined in the Serious Breach SOP QD 00000245. This concludes our 3 main topics for this awareness video. So what were the key messages? Do you remember? Going forward, we will, up front, select countries and sites to conduct trials in, to harvest the benefits of the changes in the new regulation. We will increase the transparency of our clinical trials to the public. And going forward, serious breaches to the regulation or protocol shall be reported to CETIS within 7 days of becoming aware of them. The EU clinical trial regulation means substantial changes in the ways clinical trials are assessed and managed in EU. These changes affect health authorities, ethics committees, investigator sites, and of course also Ferring. The shift from complying with the EU Clinical Directive to the EU Clinical Regulation is very much a shift in mindset, from processes in the interest of companies and authorities to processes that in their core serves patients, not only with medicinal products, but also through information sharing with every EU citizen. We embrace new initiatives to serve patients, because at Ferring, people come first.